Let's solve leetcode question 206. Reverse a linked list. The question states that a single linked list will be given. We have to return the reverse linked list. For example, a linked list is given like this. We have to return this linked list like this. So to reverse the linked list, first we have to break this link and we have to connect this link to the null node. Then we have to break this link and we have to connect this link to the previous node. Then we have to break this link and we have to connect this link to the previous node. Then we have to break this link and we have to connect to the previous node. Then we have to break this link and connect to the previous node. See the approach for the following question. First we have to initialize node temp as head, then previous as null and front as null. These are the 4 steps to reverse the linked list. Is friend equals to temp.next, we'll assign this node as friend. Then step 2 is temp.next equals to previous, we'll break this link and we'll assign to the previous node which is null. Then step 3 is previous is equals to temp, we are updating previous value to the temp, so this will become previous. Then step 4 is temp equals to friend, so we are updating temp value to the friend. Then this process will continue again. We'll update this node as friend, we'll break this link and we'll connect to the previous node. Then we'll update this temp as previous, then we'll update temp as friend. Then again it will continue, we'll assign this node as friend, then we'll break this link, we'll assign this next to the previous node, then we'll update previous value, then previous value, and we'll update temp value. Again we'll update this node as friend, we'll break this link, we'll update this node to the previous node, then we'll update this node as previous, then we'll update temp value. Again we'll update this null as friend, then we'll assign this node next to the previous node, we'll break this, then we'll assign previous to this node, then temp will update it to null, then loop stops, we'll assign head equals to previous.